I'm the Reverend Bill Zelazny, and I welcome you to our Channing Memorial Church 2021 Summer Service program. The Middle East has been in armed conflict off and on for over 70 years. Last year, Dan Kurtzer, who has been the ambassador to both Israel and Egypt, was interviewed about the state of the Israeli-Arab territories and conditions and the tensions going on there. He noted that since 1973, Israel has been in a number of conflicts with Arab actors, but not one of them has been primarily with an Arab state. While Arab states have sometimes come into some of those wars, most of them have been with the PLO, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Islamic Jihad. His assessment is that the state system in the Middle East has ceased to play a very significant role. What that means for the Arabs and for the Israelis is that they live with shifting and elusive balance of power, which is often affected by actors over which the major Arab states have limited direct control. He contends that the current Palestinian-Israeli conflict is taking place in a region which is largely dysfunctional. It is a place where state failures, weaknesses of the regimes, government crises, and endemic problems that seem impervious to solutions abound. Population growth has led to the possibility that young people will not be able to ever find jobs. There is food scarcity, economic inequality, and widespread uncontrollable corruption. Our presenter today has been a reporter with several years of direct experience observing the Middle East conflict from his reporting assignments in the region. He will be talking about this from his personal experience and perspective, recognizing, as he said, that in almost any discussion about this topic, there are strong feelings on all sides of the issues. So I invite you today to set aside prejudices and loyalties and hear what he has to say with an open mind. Our chalice lighting words are adapted from chalice lighting written by Lindsay Bates. In a world with many shadows, a chalice of light. In a world of bleakness, a chalice of warmth. In a world with terrors, a chalice of courage. In a world with turmoil, a chalice of peace. May the light of this chalice ignite a fire of commitment in our hearts and guide us to work to find paths for a better life for all. Tim Phelps is our presenter today. Tim is a relatively new member of our community, having moved here, at least for the summer months, from Washington, D.C., where he was involved with the River Road Unitarian Church. He started his career in newspaper reporting with the Providence Journal. Since he was about to be drafted for the Vietnam War, he enlisted and got an assignment to the Army Defense Language Institute to learn Arabic. After the service, he went to Cairo to freelance, serving for almost 2 years as a stringer for the New York Times. In 1986, he became bureau chief of the Middle East Bureau stationed in Cairo for the Newsday newspaper, the Long Island newspaper. In 1988, he was assigned by the newspaper to open an office in Jerusalem to cover the Palestinian Intifada, and then spent 5 years covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict after that. Tim still maintains contact with various sources in the Middle East. He says that there are important stories, many unreported, to tell about conditions and policies in the Middle East on both sides of the line. I present to you Mr. Tim Phelps.
Good morning. In 1988, I was a newspaper correspondent covering the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. I had received a tip that there would be trouble in the tiny village of Husan, just outside of Israel. I had made it a practice to try and witness events during this conflict because both sides, I found, lied constantly. So I drove out to Bethlehem, where I lived at the time, and down into the village, which from a distance was an idyllic place of ancient sandstone huts nestled in olive groves. I saw immediately the telltale sign of smoke, black smoke rising from burning tires, arranged as a barricade to keep the Israeli soldiers out. Now this, like most others in the West Bank, was a largely symbolic protest. The burning tires were not doing anything but polluting the atmosphere. But the Israeli army could never avoid a challenge. Sure enough, within an hour, a small Israeli patrol came racing down the hill and started firing at the Shabab, the youths of Palestine, whose faces were covered with their keffiyehs. This was for me a terrifying moment because I had no way of knowing whether the Israelis were firing rubber-coated bullets or shooting to kill with live ammunition. The Shabab scattered into the village, where I stood watching the cat and mouse game that ensued as the soldiers tried to apprehend or disable the youths. When the Israeli lieutenant who commanded the patrol spotted me in my obviously foreign clothes, dodging bullets in a doorway, he asked me in Arabic, sort of absurdly, where I was from. I responded in Arabic that I was a foreign correspondent from the US. And speaking English now, he ordered me out of the village immediately. I left slowly and so reluctantly because I was afraid, with me no longer there to witness, there could be a massacre. It had happened. The next day, I was at an Israeli kibbutz, a communal farm outside Jerusalem, where I belonged to a swimming pool. In the shower, as naked as I was the Israeli lieutenant I had encountered in Husan the day before. We became friends. He invited me home to meet his wife for dinner. He explained to me that he wanted me out because he was afraid the presence of a journalist would escalate the situation and people would get killed. He was a leftist who was opposed to the occupation. This was an important lesson to me, that there were feeling human beings on both sides of the conflict, even in the army. I spent 7 years over 2 tours as a correspondent in the Middle East. I reported everywhere in Israel and the Arab world, but the West Bank and Gaza were a special focus and concern for me. With the recent fighting in Gaza, I thought I would talk today about my personal experiences in the Palestinian Territories. In the Six-Day War in June 1967, when Israel preemptively attacked its Arab neighbors, I, like most Americans, was rooting for the presumptive underdog, Israel. But in 1970, I started studying Arabic intensively for a year at the U.S. Army's Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and began to see a different perspective. By 1973, when Egypt surprised Israel with the Yom Kippur attack across the Suez Canal, I was rooting for the other side. In 1976, I moved to Egypt, where I freelanced for the New York Times. Living in the Arab world further shifted my perspective. When I came back to the US 2 years later, I found it very hard to discuss the Middle East, even with some of my friends. In 1986, I was hired by the Long Island paper Newsday as their Middle East bureau chief, living in both Cairo and Jerusalem. One of my first stories was covering the war crimes trial of John Demjanjuk, the accused death camp guard. Hearing the testimony of the survivors of the death camps was a powerful reminder to me of the reason why Israel was created. I often think of the anti-Semitism that led the world to turn a blind eye to the atrocities against the Jewish people in Germany, starting well before World War II. The following year, I plunged into the issues of the Israeli occupation with a 3-part series on life for Palestinians in the West Bank. I spent several days and nights each living in Dheisheh, a Palestinian refugee camp outside Bethlehem, in the West Bank city of Hebron, and in a small village in the West Bank. In the refugee camp, I saw the constant clashes between the Palestinians and the Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians in the camps were essentially prisoners in their own makeshift homes, living with little or no sanitation in hovels that had existed since 1948. In Hebron, I witnessed the daily clashes between the Palestinians and Israeli settlers, who in this case were religious fanatics who believed all of the West Bank belongs to Israel based on claims from 2,000 years ago. In the village, Nahalim, where Palestinians have lived as beekeepers and farmers since the Middle Ages, I saw how the Israeli settlements that literally surround the village constantly eat away at its life-sustaining olive groves through expropriation of their land. Now, no one had ever attempted anything like this before. The articles were hugely controversial within the paper, and when they were finally published, sparked demonstrations outside the Newsday building on Long Island. At the same time, I detected rumblings of a change within the Palestinians. Peaceful sit-down protests at Birzeit University north of Jerusalem produced a violent response from the Israeli army. The Israelis clearly saw the growing nonviolence resistance movement as a threat, deporting its chief architect, my friend Mubarak Awad, to the US. Then came the explosion. The Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, erupted in December 1987, with Palestinians blocking streets and throwing large stones at Israeli cars and soldiers. This was the first time since the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967 that there had been any wide-scale resistance. The defense minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, now known as a martyr for peace, directed the army to respond by smashing the knees of protesters with bullets or batons so that they might never walk or protest again. Soldiers in Gaza used military-grade tear gas made in the US in confined places like small one-room houses, killing hundreds of children and elderly people through asphyxiation. They sometimes opened fire with live ammunition. When they used rubber-coated bullets instead, they often fired at very close range, sometimes lethal. I broke the story that Israeli soldiers had buried 3 Palestinian men alive. These were things I witnessed with my own eyes. The Intifada dragged on. Israeli soldiers of Arab Druze origin entered Nahalim, the village I had profiled and gotten very close to, and without provocation opened fire, killing 5. This was confirmed by an Israeli inquiry. My wife, Helen Winternitz, was living there at that time, writing a book about the village. In October 1990, Israeli soldiers opened fire outside Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem at demonstrators protesting extremist plans to demolish the mosque, the 3rd holiest site in Islam, to rebuild the ancient Jewish temple, the holiest site in all Judaism. I was there minutes later and saw the carnage. 17 Palestinians dead, 150 injured. The Israeli government closed down all schools in the West Bank for several years, creating a generation of illiterate Palestinian children. My story of the uneducated children in a village north of Jerusalem created a backlash against me within my own paper. There were Israeli heroes in this story. My friends, Ori Nir and Joel Greenberg, both fluent Arabic speakers, covered the uprising for Israeli newspapers, risking their lives as Israelis working in the West Bank to report firsthand the brutality of the Israeli army. Ori risked jail by refusing to serve his army reserve duty in the occupied territories. Both of them were excoriated and ostracized by Israelis. When the kneecapping were filmed by an Israeli cameraman, he too was ostracized by his neighbors on a kibbutz. There were, of course, also Israeli victims. I interviewed Israelis who were maimed or their loved ones killed when bombs exploded on civilian buses or in busy markets. You might feel this is a one-sided presentation, and perhaps it is. But the truth is not always balanced. And what I am telling you is the truth as I saw it in 7 years of living and working in the Middle East. It is a perspective you will seldom see in the American press. And my editors at Newsday were heroic to allow me to write what I saw. Conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians are definitely one-sided. In May of this year, violence erupted from Gaza over Israelis moving into a Palestinian neighborhood of Jerusalem, forcibly evicting Palestinians who had lived there for generations. Rockets were fired at Israeli towns near Gaza. By the end of the month, 13 Israelis had been killed, including 2 children. In retaliation, Israeli warplanes and artillery killed 256 Palestinians, including 66 children. And they left 72,000 people homeless, almost all of them innocent of any violence. So what is to be done about this terrible situation? It must be said that the Palestinians passed up a golden opportunity to reach many of their goals at the Camp David summit hosted by Jimmy Carter in 2000. What followed instead were new rounds of Palestinian violence that alienated many on the Israeli left. Today, I estimate that only 25% of Israeli voters support parties that actively seek a peace agreement with Palestine. It is not a bad thing that Benjamin Netanyahu was replaced as prime minister, perhaps only temporarily, but the new government is too fragile to make peace. The situation on the Palestinian side is no more hopeful. Palestinians are divided between the PLO, whose leadership is inept, and Hamas, whose leadership is too committed to militancy to make peace. Of course, the most reasonable solution, a democratic country, including Israelis and Palestinians, will never happen, as Palestinians would have a slight majority. Well-meaning people on both sides are abandoning the so-called two-state solution. I think the reality is that Israel will continue to build settlements in the occupied territories, gradually absorbing the West Bank into Israel proper, using its harsh policies as a tool to drive Palestinians to immigrate. If you would like to support Palestinian refugees, I recommend sending money to anira.org. That's A, N as in Nancy, E, R as in red, A.org. It is an old and venerable American charity, and you can be assured the money will be well spent. If you would like to support the growing number of American Jewish citizens who lobby in Washington for balanced US policy on Israel, check out or donate to Americans for Peace Now or jstreet.org, just like it sounds. If you would like to read about the conflict, I recommend two books, both written decades ago, but they still portray accurately the current situation. A Season of Stones, the book written by my former wife, Helen Winternitz, on the village of Nahalim, and the wonderful Israeli writer Amos Oz's In the Land of Israel. Thank you for listening.
This Sunday service program and all of our programs and operations here at Channing Church are possible because of financial gifts given to the church from our members and friends and supporters by their pledges and their Sunday contributions. I hope that today you will help support this church by going to our website, www.channingchurch.org. Scroll down to the Give image, click on that, and then follow the directions to make a one-time or multiple-time donation. All gifts, regardless of size, are important for this church. If you have found this service and our other services interesting and meaningful, please come back next week and let a friend know about them and about Channing Church. You can guide them to our website, www.channingchurch.org, for more information about the church and our program and Unitarian Universalism. In closing, may we hear the melody of life and find ourselves singing harmony. May we feel in our bones the rhythms of life and find ourselves dancing. So be it.